Hello everyone, this is the Fantasy Creation Immersive Storytelling panel for the Mystical Realms Fair. Before I get too much into anything, I want to say thank you first for everyone who voted in the polls. This helps me to understand the things that you are most interested in to help make this panel exactly what you were hoping for. So thank you, I appreciate that so much, and I'm glad you could make it. So next step is to establish why I'm qualified to be giving this panel at all, to give you an idea of where I'm coming from with it. So, why listen to me? Well, I have two fantasy stories going right now, both supported by Patreon, and this is an important point to remember here because every writer has a different journey. Some people go through traditional publishing, other people self-publish. I tried, from what I understand, a very, very new process where other people I've told about it, readers and writers alike, have said they've never really heard much about it. There are other Patreon writers out there, they're just not as widely known as their visual arts counterparts. So this is something that a lot of different writers do, and it does work for a lot of people. So as a Patreon writer, I have two fantasy stories ongoing right now. You can get both of those free to read on Patreon, or you can check them out on Wattpad. Either one, whichever one's easier for you. This is how I've structured my storytelling. And this is where I come from as a writer. The different paths that I've taken to get here. I do also have a bachelor's degree in creative writing. I've run a couple of different writing workshops. I've been hosting panels for ages, so there's a lot that goes into it. And all the knowledge that I'm giving you here. So that's where it comes from, as a very educated background, but also a real life experience for having these two different stories ongoing. Now, without further ado, what the panel itself contains. First thing I like to start with is the first thing you'll be starting with as a fantasy writer, is establishing your world. The next step for you is to follow your rules as you continue to tell your story. Another piece to keep in mind is the relatability of the story, not just the characters, but the story as a whole. Something you guys mentioned specifically wanting to know was how to craft your plot, and I do go into that there. I spent a lot more time leaning onto the world building because that seemed to be more where you were interested, but I do mention the plot elements as well, and something that I personally find very important is to balance your fan service. So, going from there, we have the next step of establishing the world. What you'll want to do is know how to make your entrance, savor that process of establishing your world, have it be naturally done, and to keep track of all the things that you do. So, where we start with this, with making an entrance, is acknowledging that this first scene is everything. Ironically, this means you're going to be mostly going by intuition. This scene is going to be fun for you, generally speaking. There isn't a whole lot of plot that you need to establish. You're just trying to introduce the world to the readers for the first time. Good examples of this that I would say is The Thief from Megan Whalen Turner and The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance on Netflix. These are two different examples. Obviously, one's a little more time consuming than the other, so that's why I gave you two different examples, so that you could get the idea of what you'd be looking at. How it works in The Thief is that Megan Whalen Turner takes the time to establish a certain character. She does write in first person, but as someone who doesn't particularly like that a lot, I loved this series. She does a very good job with it. She writes in first person, she establishes this character, and she establishes the power dynamic between him and the characters that are around him. She does an excellent job of it. So the moment you meet the player character, the POV character, the thief, he's being broken out of prison by someone through legal channels, the mages to the king, because he needs something done. The only person who's going to be able to turn over that imprisonment was someone so close to the king, because he stole from the king and boasted about it, which is how he got caught. These are all things you learn more or less in the beginning, and this is what you need to know for their dynamic, the tensions between them, and how much control one has over the other. That's the system. Dark Crystal's a totally different approach. It kind of ties into step 2 here, where it says don't overstuff. Even exposition-heavy intros, like in The Dark Crystal, it should resonate with your audience enough to feel like it's an introduction to the world, not a study session at midterms. If you watch The Dark Crystal introduction on Netflix, it feels a lot like storytelling by a campfire. It feels very real, very organic and natural as it's being told to you, as they explain the structure of the world, the people that live on it, the purpose of the crystal, all of it in the beginning. So it feels very realistic, it feels very organic and immersive. You want to hear more. And that's the structure that you want. That's why you wouldn't overstuff your story. You don't want it to feel like it's a slog to get through. And as I say, you get a feel for the baseline, and I do mention the term here, status quo. There is something that I want to make sure you take with a grain of salt here, because this is an art, not a science. You are establishing the baseline of the story. This is true of what the world is like. The introduction should do that. But it can also upheave it as it introduces it. Which, when people think status quo, they think, oh, well, I need to see their daily life and nothing's really going wild. I put right there, plot doesn't have a whole lot of place here. You might be like, okay, so we're not going to have anything important happen in the beginning. Not true. I love doing things like that. It's one of my favorite stunts to pull on readers, is starting the story with them in the trunk of the first chapter. Like, they can't see what's happening, but they know the road is rocky. Like, I love doing that, just throwing them into the upheaval. One example of this is the first playable sequence in Dragon Age 2, where you're playing with the Hawk family running out of the town they've been living in for years at this point. So their status quo literally just got thrown out the window. And that's the new status quo. Like, you've come in on what is status quo for Hawk. Your life is falling apart again. Like, that's normal for Hawk. That's normal for Thetis, really. So this world is being established. This is its baseline. So when I say status quo and saying plot doesn't have a whole lot of place there, it doesn't necessarily lock you into that. Don't feel like you can do it wrong if there's something going on that's like, oh, this is a plot point. That's okay. Just don't go wild with it. Don't try to introduce your whole plot in the beginning. You never go back to the place that Hawk left for that baseline. Never go back there. As an example. So why would you ever mention anything about it? Why would you go really deep into that area? It doesn't make sense. So you can do that, you just have to go into it knowing that's what you're doing and have that as your plan. Now, when I say savor it, what I really mean is, like, there's no rush. You don't have to communicate everything about the world and your characters and the people in it all out of the gate. Don't feel like you have to give everyone context for everything. It's fine. It's fine if something happens in the first chapter that your readers don't feasibly completely understand the meaning and symbolism of. That's okay. They don't need to know all of it right then and there. Which kind of ties right into, don't be afraid to go back for seconds. When you mention a story element, revisit it. And do it organically as well. Just make sure when you're going back to it, it makes sense. If you feel like a conversation should go on longer or something to that effect, look at the different story elements that the characters in that conversation know. Is there something they should really mention that it's kind of weird they haven't yet? Like, go that way with it. Make it feel like it fits there. Now, the other thing is to make sure your observations matter. One of the workshops that I was in college, and I want to say the way a writing workshop is that people give you feedback and they don't filter it. It's your job to filter it. You use manners, obviously, but they're not going to critique their own critiques. That's your job as the writer. So when I was in a workshop in college, one of the things that I was given by another writer was about a scene in the beginning where someone leans up against a car and props their foot up against the wheel. And their thing was like, well, which foot was it? And I was like, does it matter? Because it's not like, the only reason that's like which foot they used would be relevant is if there was something about their foot or leg that I needed to observe. So, for example, if they had, like, this was a sci-fi and they had a robot leg, that would be significant. And I would say they propped their robot leg up against the car. Or they, prop themselves up on their robot leg, like gleaming in the afternoon sunset or something. It's not afternoon sunset, I do what I want. This is why I'm a writer, not a speaker. But the point is, I wouldn't mention it unless there was something important to observe. Similarly, like if they had an injury, then obviously you would say, they winced as they leaned their bad foot up against the tire, or if they had a bad knee, they would sit on the car altogether. They would never just prop a leg up because either they're bending their bad knee or they're putting weight on it. So those are the kinds of things. When you're making an observation, make sure it's significant. I've seen posts like this around on Tumblr too, where I saw someone say, well, do I really have to describe what every single character wears? No, you don't. You don't have to describe what they're wearing from head to toe. You just need to give a loose impression of an aesthetic. Something that's important, but that establishes their character. It doesn't have to be head to toe exactly what everything is, down to brand and fabric composition. That's not essential. So go with things that mean something, because every single word, every sentence, everything that doesn't have significance in your story detracts from the meaning and the impact of that story. You don't want to do that, obviously, so make sure whatever observations you make and include are relevant and they matter and they're significant in some way, whether that's to character development, to plot development, or power dynamics, establishing interactions between characters, you name it. It's got to be important. Now, be natural when you do this. You want to explore your world organically. Make it feel like they're really going through it. And that's where immersion really comes from, is making sure that this story feels like it is actually being navigated in a natural, organic way. One of the things that you can do to do this that feels natural without a ton of effort is daily little details. One example of this is again through Dragon Age. 2 words here, Syrah and Miser. The context these words are in make it so they never need to be defined or described. The people who are playing these games will hear these words and know exactly what they mean in context. So even side characters use them. Mostly side characters use them, to be perfectly honest. Just someone you walk by as an NPC who will say, Syrah, please don't touch that. Like, Miser, you're going to have to wait like everyone else. These are polite terms you would use for someone who doesn't have an official title like Lord or Lady, but you're allowed to be kind of impolite when you use them. And that's really what it comes down to, is you know what those are, and they don't have to be described to you because of the context they're used in. These are just little details that give the world more life, because you have an idea of something that's unique to it. You could have just said Sir and Ma'am and it wouldn't have been anything different, but they made it Syrah and Miser, and it added a little flavor that didn't take any extra work on anyone's part. No one had to describe this to anybody. You know at the moment you hear it what it's supposed to be. Now, that said, when you really want to make something natural as well, you want it to be as interconnected as possible, without being limited. So when you come up with something in your plot where you realize you're up against a problem and you don't know how to solve it, my recommendation to you would be to go through your story about the tools and techniques and cultures that you've already established and see if any of those will solve your problem. Start with the things that are already established, because you're going to run into problems you didn't think of. Try to use the things that are already out there. This will help you avoid things like pulling something out of the air in chapter 12 because you didn't realize this problem was going to be a problem until you were staring it in the face. Use the tools you have to avoid basically just like writer rescue, where you've backed yourself into a corner and now you've got to pull something out of the air. Nothing disappoints a reader faster than feeling like you didn't know what you were doing and then you just made something up to get out of it without having to work too hard at it. And it feels like it came out of absolutely nowhere. No one likes that. So, best thing you can do is look through and make sure you have all of that. I will go more into keeping record of things like that in a bit. Now, there are 2 different methods with being natural with things as far as exploring the world organically goes. There's character first and world first. The character first method really comes down to making sure your character interacts with everything you're trying to explore. This can be very difficult depending on what it is you're trying to explore. There are open-ended ways to do this. For example, Legend of Zelda, you've got Link. He's the hero of the literal world. He travels everywhere, he goes everywhere, he touches everything, he takes it with him when he goes. Like, there is nothing he can't explore, steal, borrow with some intention of returning. there's nothing he can't experience as the player character. Because he has got a canon reason to be there. It all works for him. Done. Now, the world first version of this is with gear and concepts and abilities that are really compelling and interesting, where these are the things you'll be exploring, and the people who pass by them are the ones who just kind of happen to be in your story. I use Kingdom Hearts as an example of this, not because it is necessarily a good canon example of this being executed properly. There are a lot of concepts in Kingdom Hearts that deserved more attention that didn't get it, but you can certainly understand what I mean by that when you look at the concept of nobodies, a person who's lost their heart, the heartless, which are, of course, don't think about it, it's the heart of that person that's been separated from their body. Those are interesting concepts. What happens to this person? What is the world like through the eyes of a heartless? What's the world like through the eyes of a nobody? Keyblades are very interesting. They're weapons that are personalized to the wielder. Those are compelling. How does that happen? How does that work? So on and so forth. These concepts are very interesting concepts, and you can explore your world through those in a different way, where you would need to be either a nobody or a Keyblade wielder to have a place in this story to explore these concepts, most likely. Like, that would make you main character status. You could flesh it out a bit more with characters who fall outside of these things but are impacted by these things. But those are probably going to be fewer and farther between than actual people who are directly involved with these concepts. Another thing to keep in mind is that, kind of doubling back here a bit with the character structure, the character first structure, for those of you who don't have characters who have an excuse to be everywhere and anywhere and touch everything, that's fine too. You will be able to come up with certain excuses. I'm going to use Final Fantasy VII as an example, where you've got Cloud, who is a former Shinra employee and has no business being in Shinra buildings, but has all the skills he needs to break into them and take their stuff and leave. Like, he can do that. He has all the abilities he needs to do that. All the people and resources too. So there's no reason. He's not supposed to in canon, but he can do it. He's got a motive to do it. He's just not allowed to do it according to their rules, but he's not following those. So you don't necessarily need it to be permitted in canon. It just has to make sense and feel natural. The difference being, like, he has no legal reason in canon to be in a Shinra building, but he's gonna do it anyway. But it's not like he's about to, like, break into a Chocobo farm, steal one of every pair of shoes they have and leave. Like, you have to make sure it makes sense. You wouldn't have Cloud suddenly becoming a scientist with Shinra. It doesn't make sense for him to know all of those things. He doesn't really know the science behind it all. And that's fine. You have other characters who can explain that. So keep that in mind. Just because you don't have a character who can go anywhere and do anything doesn't mean you can't see things you're not, like, you need to see, but maybe that character isn't supposed to. And you can use other cast members to kind of fill in the rest. On that note, keeping track. Now, I am aware that when you're writing something down, the last thing you're going to think of is like, well, why would I write it down twice? Okay, here's the thing. You're in chapter 12 now, let's say, and you've just realized that the big bad you ran into last time in chapter 3 attacked the hero, but you can't remember how effective this attack was. Now, like, they went to punch them, you're pretty sure, reasonably sure. But you can't remember if the punch connected, and if it did, where they were hit. And if they were hit, how bad the injury was. You don't remember any of that. So, but the person who got punched for sure does remember. They remember. So you need to know now. So you're in chapter 12, you go all the way back to chapter 3. You think it's chapter 3. It might have been 4, could have been 5, maybe 7. You don't remember. So you're skimming through all these chapters, trying to find this fight. Maybe you hit Control F and you type the word punch in and hope that maybe there weren't a lot of punches thrown in the story. Who knows? You're trying to figure it out. So you dig through all that, you find the chapter. The chapter in question is 6,000 words long. You now have to read it to try to figure out if you said where they got hit and what the injury was, realizing that the recovery could have taken place a chapter afterwards, or a couple chapters afterwards. You don't actually know. This is where writing it down comes really in handy in like a separate bulleted list. You can use Word, you can use PowerPoint, you can use Excel with different tabs for each chapter. If you use PowerPoint, you can use slides for chapters and break it down as many slides as you need. Who knows? You can do all kinds of different things. There are apps for this, there are software programs for this. Not all of them are free. Some of them might have been discontinued, so that, because I don't really use those. I don't like using apps and software. I find it almost too cluttered and clunky for me, but a lot of people love that much structure. I'm honestly of the opinion that when I write something down in a story, I just jot it down in my own records, and it's much easier for me to just do it in a regular Microsoft Office program, whichever one I feel like using at the time, and go from there. I do have one that I've stuck with recently that's my favorite. I use PowerPoint for it. I do have a guide on it, however, it is for patrons at $5 or higher, so I can't go too much into the details of it. It's not necessarily fair to people who paid for that guide. So that is there, but obviously you can make your own system from scratch. I use PowerPoint for mine. You can do whichever you like. You can try a bunch. Go for it, because I've been trying a bunch for years when I made mine. So the way I would recommend doing it is to write your chapters out. When you are combing through and doing edits, that's when you would want to switch gears and have your record keeping system up and write down anything that you wrote that was relevant that you might need to reference later, but you don't necessarily want to write, like, go through 8,000 words to find it. Don't really want that. You still probably have to do a Control-F search for the word punch and hope that there are a lot of punches weren't thrown, but at least you don't have to read through 6,000 to 8,000 words or something crazy like that. Write it down. You don't want to forget these things. A lot of people will call it like writers, they'll call it the Universe Bible, Handbook, Guide. I call it a continuity log. Everyone calls it something different. Go with what works for you. The middle one there is comparing settings aesthetically, by population, by danger level. These are important for you to remember so that you can make these places feel distinct from one another. You want the hero's home to feel different than when they're out foraging in caves. You want these places to feel distinct. That's how you would set this up. Compare location A to location B. Compare downtown to the impoverished area of the neighborhood. Make them feel different. The clearer they are in your mind, the easier it will be to depict those. So absolutely, you can take a bunch of notes on this, write all of this out, and even if it doesn't make it in, it does make these things clearer and more distinct in your minds. It will improve your writing by relation. The other thing you can do when you're really trying to iron out a place is to envision it with all 5 senses, knowing that you're not going to use them all. There's no way you would. It's a really weird thing to do, to describe a place and make sure you check off every sense. Like, you would not necessarily describe what a grocery store feels like tactilely. That's a little more of like a beach thing where you can feel the sand. So you are going to keep those different things in mind, but describing all of those things is still important. It makes this clear and distinct to you on its own without needing the comparison. And you can use 5 senses as writing from a person's perspective to make that person's perception of that place clear as well. For example, some people love malls, some people hate them. How they're described will make it completely different based on who's there and who enjoys it. If it's someone who loves the mall, can't get enough of it, you're gonna hear all about the lights, the sounds, the colors, the people who are smiling and shopping and all of that, like just being excited to be there. Versus someone who hates the mall is going to be like the glaring lights. They're gonna talk about the cacophony if they read a lot and have big words to use. The chaos, the noise of the people bustling into each other, just bumping around, not looking, just going where they need to go. There's nowhere to get away from them. Like, that's how someone who doesn't enjoy a trip to the mall is going to describe it versus someone who does. So you can also do it that way to distinguish between how people react to a place. So keeping track and keeping record of things like this, very, very good for exploring a world and explaining it all in all. The other way I mentioned keeping track, this is something that you shouldn't feel locked into, but it is always helpful to look at. These are two different storytelling structures. There are many, many more, but these are just ones that are fairly common and covered in the degree that I earned. I told you about that. This is just something to keep in mind. You've been consuming content your whole life. Odds are you have an innate understanding of the 3-act structure, as an example. So don't feel like you have to go through your plot and bullet it out to follow the 3-act structure. You don't have to do that. Unless it helps you, then absolutely do it. Your writing style is your writing style, but don't feel like you're like a horrible writer or you're neglecting something if you don't do these things. You don't have to do these things unless they work for you. That's it. That should be your thought. And you're not locked into it every single story either. You can have a loose idea of Act 1 and then be like, I was gonna end Act 1 in a couple chapters, but it feels more right to end it now. Go for it. Be flexible. Adapt to your story. Follow it. And don't necessarily feel like you have to structure it either. We will touch more on this later. Similar with the monomyth or the hero's journey, you can have an idea for ordinary world call to adventure. The refusal of the call could be external. It could be something that the player character, I keep saying that, the POV character didn't actually want. The POV character could want to answer the call, but it was refused for them and there are consequences for it. Who knows? It doesn't fit every single thing. Not all of it goes this way. So by all means, look at these and use them if they fit your stories, if they fit your style, and don't use them if they don't. Reach for them every now and again, use them to the extent that you need to. This is just something that gives you a clearer path to follow if you need it, or to know which one that you might be leaning towards more. And maybe ones that aren't here. Look up different storytelling structures and see what they're like. See which one speaks to your style or to your story specifically. Use that to organize your thoughts if you need to. That's really what this is for. It's your benefit, if anything. No one else is going to see it, just you. Other thing you need to do, next step, following your rules. You want to know how to create them so that they make sense and fit your story. You want to discover your loopholes because they're very convenient, and you want to keep to your rules also. I know those feel contradictory. Bear with me here. Step 1, creating your rules. Now, consistency in the atmosphere is really important. You don't want rules that feel like they don't belong in this story. As an example, comparing feelings-based magic with ritual magic. Those of you who've been to my panels before, you're like, I remember this. Those of you who haven't, this is fresh to you, totally new. You're going to want to reflect your plot with your structure of rules. For example, a story about friendship will do better with an emotional-based magic structure because the story is about how you feel and the bonds that you form with people. That's what this is all about. So a ritual-based magic might feel like it doesn't belong here, versus a more sentimental, feelings-based magic that kind of meshes better with the notion of belonging. That's just something to keep in mind. When you're making your rules, it does generally perform better if they feel like they're part of the world. Now, discovering your loopholes. You're going to be asking yourself, why make rules if I'm going to break them? You aren't. You have to follow them, but your little muse gremlins do not. So they can do whatever they want. You're going to want to figure out what that is before you get to there. And they'll probably still surprise you, but we'll take it one step at a time. Whenever something is created for a specific use in real life or in fiction, people generally find other ways to use it. I've included a couple different examples here just to give you an idea. These are real world examples, but obviously you can transfer the loose concept of these to other things. So, a wet blanket over a tent entrance makes a cool breeze when the wind blows. It's the world's earliest form of AC. Now, there's also another person in history, Anna Strong, during the American Revolution, who would hang certain color and types of clothing on the clothesline when things were safe or unsafe. And we aren't even positive if this is what her intent was, because that's how sneaky this code was. Like, it wasn't something that was really well documented, it was a secret code. So, they can't really say for sure if that's what it was or not, but they're reasonably confident that's what it was. This is not the intended purpose of a clothesline, obviously. Neither would you willfully get a blanket wet. In fact, being a wet blanket is something that is negative. If someone says, don't be such a wet blanket, they are making fun of you. They think you're being downer, and they're being a downer, and they don't like you. You're ruining this. But here it is, a wet blanket being useful. The opposite of its meaning. These things will exist with pretty much everything that you come up with. So be prepared for that. Think of different ways you can use the items other than what you made them for. It'll be definitely useful to you down the line in some way or another. Could be in this story, could be in a sequel, could be in a prequel, could just be cool. Just a cool thought. You could make bonus content off it, who knows? The questions you want to ask yourself once you have these loopholes is the alternative use for this taboo, or is it even illegal? Is it only illegal for certain people? If so, why? Is it a license thing? Is it a class thing? Like, you want to ask yourself those questions. Does this loophole see regular use, or is it unique to a certain group or individual? If it's unique to them, why is it unique to them? Is it a well-guarded secret, or is it you literally can't do it? Unless you are one of these people. Like, you don't have a lightsaber unless you're a Jedi. I know it's a sci-fi example, but run with me. Or rather, you weren't given one, you might take one if you're a Sith. Anyway, the point is, you're not supposed to have one unless you are one of those two things. You'll want to understand what those are before you get there, because it'll just make your life that much easier. The one thing you really want to mention and remember with loopholes is don't guard your characters from messing up. That's where that word came from, messing up. Don't shield them from it. Your characters are going to make mistakes, and mistakes make the story, really. If people made good choices, we wouldn't have the story. If Ariel just decided, nah, I'm good, like, there goes the story. If she was like, maybe I won't deal with the Sea Witch, story's gone. Like, that's, you have to run with that. Your characters are going to make mistakes, and your instinct might be to protect them, but don't. You aren't here to write about perfect people. You're here to write about people who have messed up. Now, keeping to your rules. This goes back to my note-taking here. Remember this for your system of choice. Compose a list of norms and exceptions for whatever system you're using, whether it's Magitech, Magic, the Force, whatever thing that you've made. Keep a list of norms and things that are outliers and things that are completely impossible so that you know what they are in advance and you've established it throughout the story and you can keep to it. So it's not like it's possible if you're the main character but no one else can do it. And that's literally the only reason. Like, the main character should have a reason to do these things that are outliers or impossible. And whatever happens, whatever you do, whatever comes up, do not use magic to get yourself out of a bad situation. Do not do it, because the moment you use this to break the rules and free yourself from a corner you backed yourself into, you will lose so many people you don't even know. Because it shows that you are willing to break the rules you took all this time establishing to get something for you out of it. And that's not fun as a reader. That's like, well, then none of the stakes matter, everything is meaningless, I didn't want to feel like this, and they'll get disappointed and leave. So, and who could blame them? So definitely follow your rules, stick to them, even when they're not necessarily the best for you and you've ended up somewhere you didn't expect to be. Now, the last thing you'll also want to mention that's On a similar note, is that combat should be consistent and variances in combat should be explained. What I mean by that is, if your main character A gets in a fight with Big Bad B in Chapter 4, that needs to be something that's the bar now. If they reunite in Chapter 6, if character A is going to win, there has to be an explanation, especially if character B is exactly the same. If the baddie is just as strong as they were before, and nothing is wrong, and suddenly they've lost, you need an explanation. Is character A stronger? Is the big bad having a bad day? I don't know, like, if they're grieving, if they're wounded, what's happened? Or is it geographical? Is it something to that effect? You have to look at things to that nature. For example, with Artemis Fowl, as one example, the fairies in that story need to replenish their magic every now and again. This is why a fight might shift in favor of someone fighting against them if they're out of their magic. So all of that should be explained, all of that should be consistent, so that it feels fair. And it doesn't feel like a character won just because the author likes them or needs them to. Now, the other section here we're on now is relatability. A lot of people, when they think about this, they think about the characters, not anything else. I'm going to go into the people, the places, and the situations in your story because they all have to feel relatable in some way or another, the very least realistic. But we will start with the common one, the core one. People. Your character should feel real, even your side ones. One example of this is in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. When the player character for one of the different branches, they hop around in the story, the player character Ike in this case ends up in a conversation with a shopkeep where they flirt with him, and he, being a bag of rocks, does not realize this is what is happening. I love Ike, don't get me wrong, he's just dumb as a stump sometimes, and does not realize he is being hit on. And his friend Soren steps in and starts flirting with the shopkeep and tells Ike to go do something, he'll take care of this. He starts flirting with the shopkeep instead and negotiating their sale, essentially. So that shopkeep felt very realistic as a person. Like, this is like medieval times, they can do whatever they want. This is their shop. If they want to hit on everyone who comes to the door, whether they're a super jacked mercenary or a porcelain-skinned scholar strategist, they can do that. That's their choice. Feels very realistic, and then it showcases the differences between Ike and Soren, because Ike does what Soren tells him to. Soren's like, get out of here, Ike's like, okay! Like, Ike is in charge. This is his mercenary band, but if his 5-foot-tall scholar strategist friend tells him to go away, he's got this, he goes, okay, bye! Like, he doesn't feel like he's in charge in that sense. He doesn't take command unless he has to. This is obviously better for Soren, so he just leaves. This gives a whole different dynamic, and it explains a lot about them, and it feels realistic. It doesn't feel like this shopkeep was just thrown in there for the sake of it. It does actually flow quite well with the shopping structure in Fire Emblem, and because it's a small scene, it comes across as amusing and entertaining more than anything else. Now, another thing you want to focus here with making characters relatable is their dialogue. It should feel like the person that you've established is talking. Now, some people will have more difficult dialogue than others that will surprise you more, but for the most part, you're going to come up with things that make sense. Someone who reads a lot of textbooks is going to talk very differently from someone who just hates reading as a concept. Their vocabulary banks are completely different. If you're going to use a historic example, a noble person who is constantly working with a diplomatic parent and following them around to different countries is going to talk about things very, very differently from someone in the working class. They just have very different vocabularies that they use, and their dialogue and their sentence structures and the way they approach things should be reflected by that. Like, that's what that's going to impact. And that will help convey their character and make them feel more like them. Now, another thing to keep in mind is everyone is going to relate to your characters for very different reasons. It shouldn't be a shock to you if one character is liked more than another, or they're liked for certain things more than other things. That's fine. You're not trying to make every character likable to everyone, because you will not make everyone like your character. It just doesn't work like that. So commit to making this character who they are above all else. And one thing you should always do is you, as the writer, need to understand each and every single one of your characters. You need to be able to relate to them, even if you don't like them. Even if they're the villain and you hate them and everything about them, you need to relate to their motivation. You need to understand how they do, like how they think and why they do what they do. All that needs to make sense. So, there are a lot of ways to do this. One of the best-selling authors that I like to read, Jonathan Franzen, has a system where he will make this big chart where he writes down his characters and their core motivations for everything they do. This works for him. I've never done anything like that. I would find it probably a bit tedious and cumbersome. The way I write, it wouldn't work for me, but it's an exceptionally good method, something that worked for a lot of my friends in writing workshop classes. This just helped them keep their thoughts orderly. It's a simple process that way. Now, core motivations, I will say, are different than like overarching motivations. If you were using Link as an example, he wants to save the world. Pretty much everything that he does stems from that motivation. If you use Hawk from Dragon Age as an example, they just want to keep their family safe. No one's reinventing the wheel here. Almost all of their actions stem from wanting to keep their family safe. Even when they do things that are for the greater good, they're trying to keep their family safe. So if you have like a mage sympathetic Hawk, and they're trying to stick up for mages and Thetis and Kirkwall specifically, it's because they know mages, whether that's Meryl or Anders or Bethany, or they are a mage themselves. That's what they're doing. They're looking out for people like that, and they want to make this a better place for those people. That's their core motivation. And it's okay if it's selfish. A lot of people have many reasons to do things, but you want to go with the core one, the one that influences basically every single choice they make. That's what you want to keep in mind when you're writing these characters, so that you don't lose sight of that core motivation with their actions. Because eventually as a writer you can run into that pitfall of making characters do things because you need them to do them and not because they would do them. And as a reminder here, relatable is not necessarily the same as likable. There are lots of villains out there that people can relate to, and that's what makes them so chilling, is that like they're horrible people and you hate them and they're awful, but you see where they're coming from and that freaks you out. So you can have it be both of those things. Places. Fictional locations should evoke an emotion in their own right. This is something that's really important to mention. And the examples that I give here is like if you were in an alley at night, you will feel uneasy most likely, especially if it's an unfamiliar place. You'll be on alert and very attentive because you acknowledge that you are in a dark, unfamiliar place, and that's your reaction to it. Most likely. Now, if you're at the beach and it's a beautiful, perfect day, you're probably at peace or super happy, energized, who knows? Unless you hate the beach and you hate sand. Then you're mad. But we're going to assume you love the beach in this hypothetical scenario, and you're really happy to be there, and this is fantastic. These places evoke an emotion in you, and pretty much every place is going to evoke some kind of reaction. Even if that reaction is just like neutrality. There are places that are designed to not elicit a huge response from you. That you're just there to do a thing and leave. Think post offices. They're not there to do anything other than get the task done and leave. That's it. You can picture real life places. Several of them, in fact, for inspiration and fake ones. So if you're making an island, you can look at a bunch of different islands in different regions. If you're making a whole world from scratch, you're not limited to things like Earth. You don't have to do that. You don't have to pull that structure. You can, but you don't have to. Technically, you can change anything you want. You don't need a 12-month structure. You can use a 9-month one. You can use 3 seasons. Who knows? It's all up to you. You can leave it all the same. There are plenty of fantasy stories that do it. Never even mention the calendar or the seasons. They don't care. It's all up to you. You can draw that inspiration from multiple places, and you aren't restricted to it. So, enjoy it. If you're making an island, Look at all the different islands that are in the general climate range you're looking at. And go from there. Now, this inspiration will bring these locations to life as you are adding more details like that. Even if you don't use the details from the descriptions of these places, it might make you think of something that you didn't before. Just looking at descriptions of places could give you an idea of something you didn't consider for your fictional place. Having all of those details. You know, is there a public transit system? What's their main source of food? Do tourists visit? All of that will give a location more character and make it feel more like a real place that people live and go to, or maybe not if it doesn't have visitors, than anything else. And this applies whether it's a tavern or a whole city. You're going to want to describe this in detail and give it life, give it inspiration. You know, there's upscale taverns that are kind of nice and homey. There are taverns that are, like, clearly someone stabs the tables every single day. Like, you're going to want to distinguish between those two and give it that personality. Honestly, an example I would give of this for a place would be the Hanged Man, again from Dragon Age 2, because it's something that comes up time and time again. The Seneschal of Kirkwall talks about it a lot, where they're like, he says, I'm certain that there's a place somewhere that would give you that information, and like kind of implies it, and the party members that Hawk has with them are like, Hanged Man, Hanged Man. They talk about it once. There's a woman from Orlais who has traveled to Kirkwall who was like, oh, the Hanged Man, that place is filthy, and like Varric makes fun of her as soon as she's gone, like, that place is filthy, like, they tease her for it, but it is filthy. Like, that is obviously a thing that's true about it. Like, the Hanged Man is not a place that is like an upscale place, and that's exactly what the Kirkwall crew likes about it. So like, these kinds of details that are reinforced over the course of the story give that place character and make it feel like a homey place to the player, or in the case of a book, a reader. Now, the situations. This one I think is very easy to overlook because it's so closely tied to plot and kind of very easy to get into your, like, craft box with, essentially. Like, you go right into, like, I am making a story. This is what I need to happen. It's really important to remember that whether it's warfare or family issues or romantic squabbles, the situations that your characters are up against should feel relatable and feasible. I've seen a ton of things where I'm going, really, are they having this fight again? Like, whether it's family or a romantic relationship, if the same issues keep coming up, they need to come up in different ways. It could be someone's breaking point, it could be a new facet of this thing that's been solved before, but it can't just be, you know, we had this argument 2 chapters ago, we resolved it, it looked fixed, and now we're having it again because the writer needed something for us to fight about. Like, it doesn't make sense. One of the TV shows I watched on Netflix recently had this girl get really, really mad at her love interest because he was a prince and didn't say he was. And it's like, it wasn't like a movie whose name I can't remember now, but will after the fact because reasons, where it was established that this particular woman, like, despised royalty and nobility, just, like, hated them. It didn't really make sense. This was an argument in this TV show where this couple was constantly arguing about something, and they'd, like, just started to come together and, like, really be closer, and then all of a sudden it fell apart because he was a prince and didn't say he was. Like, well, of course he didn't say he was. Like, you've been established but as smart at this point, so it's kind of weird that you would think he would walk up to you and be like, I'm the prince. Like, it doesn't make sense that he would do that. And also, you are now dating the prince, so I don't see how this is a problem. Like, it didn't make sense. It felt very out of left field, and, like, it wasn't like she was still angry with him about previous dishonesties, because him being a prince would have made sense with all of that. Like, he would constantly be late or straight up not show up for things because he had to sneak out of the royal palace every time he had to go see her. Like, every time he said he was going to go see her, he had to sneak out of the royal palace to do it. If anything, this should have made her less angry, like, Like, that's what this should have been, but instead she was, like, furious, and it didn't make any sense. It's like, you were too smart for this, madam. So it felt very strange. That's what I mean with, like, feasibility. The situations that happen, the way people react, the way that events unfold should feel like something that is realistic and would actually happen. And honestly, the cornerstone of this is remembering that limitations foster creativity. One of the interviews that I read about a TV show, again, was they were thinking of having a junkyard dog be a problem for their character, their main character. But when they looked up the cost of a junkyard dog, they're like, well, we need the dog, and then the dog needs, like, an additional fee, because dog. Animal rights, essentially. Like, there was just a fee to make sure the dog was well taken care of. Makes sense. Why they didn't bake it into the cost for the dog, no one knows. Doesn't matter. Then there was, like, the handler for the dog needed to be there. Also makes sense. But it was really driving up the cost, and they were like, we do not have the money for this for one episode. Like, it didn't yield results. So they ended up having it so the main character, when he hopped the fence, landed in a porta potty instead. A porta potty to rent for a day is, like, way cheaper than the dog. So that limitation on their budget made them do something that wasn't an archetype or a trope or something that was expected in a junkyard. They did something different and innovative because they didn't have the means to do the thing that was expected. So, and again, it's not like a bad archetype. A junkyard dog is fine. No one would have been, like, upset and like, oh, how trite, and, like, turned the whole TV show off. Wouldn't have happened. But they did something more inventive because they had that limitation. So this is an important thing to look at when you are up against a wall, you are backed into a corner, and you feel like, oh, I can't believe this. Take your time. This limitation is going to make you think outside the box and force you to do something that you might not have thought of otherwise. So give it a few days, take a week, list out every possible idea you have to solve this problem. Don't criticize it. Don't start berating the list. Just write it all down, even if you think these ideas are insane. You could be like, Clifford the Big Red Dog comes through the TARDIS and saves the day. Like, just anything that you want to come up with. It doesn't have to be feasible. You are just talking ideas then, because you never know which idea is going to spawn another one. Only when you've compiled your list and feel like you aren't getting any more ideas, should you narrow it down and be like, that one requires a lot of IP I don't have. That's when you would eliminate that. This will help you get more relatable scenarios and things that make sense without being exactly necessarily the first thing you thought of. The first thing could be the perfect thing, but it might not be. Give yourself time if you feel like you're stuck. Now, here's the big thing here that I know a lot of you were thinking about: crafting your plot. A lot of this is going to be subjective because method is so different for each writer, but I am going to go into the different tips I can give you. First method, honestly, like, just, obviously not first method, this is your method, this is what you do. It varies, it depends, and the quote I'm going to use here explains a lot of that. Now, with George R.R. Martin, I did shorten this quote because it was kind of long. You can look up the full one if you want, but this is the gist of it. He says, I think there are two types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. This is a totally different process. You don't necessarily have to stick to one, though. And it can vary in the same story. It can be, this week you're a gardener, next week you're an architect. Next month, you're carefully planning a garden. Like, you are not trapped into any of these. I have my architect days, I have my gardener days. Honestly, I'm usually somewhere between the two, where I will keep a list of events that I need to happen, and whatever happens between them happens between them. Because I won't know until I've hit that aesthetic point. I won't know what that scene feels like emotionally until it's done. I won't know what's needed. Will I need a funny scene? Will I need a cathartic scene? What will I need between those scenes? So that's really where it comes down to for me, is I'm somewhere between the two. That's how it works. But I might be more architect one day, maybe more gardener another. I let myself have that freedom. And what I usually tell other people in my words, is to follow their creativity. The inspiration is like a tide. Sometimes it's in, sometimes it's out. There are days where I've written 2 sentences and been like, that's it. That's all. Nothing else coming out of here. Like, we are done. This is 2 sentences and we're out. Other days, I get possessed by the inspirational muses and I write 2,000 words in a day. Inside an hour. And that's it. I've done it. Sometimes the tide's in, sometimes the tide's out. You follow its rules. It doesn't follow yours. So, if you want to surf, you need to go where the waves are. You don't stand where you want to surf and demand that waves appear. Nothing is going to happen. So, whatever your method is, whenever you're stuck, don't be afraid to be like, why am I stuck? What's frustrating me? Is the scene boring to me? Is the story boring to me? What's going on? Try a different avenue. Try a different pathway. Go for a walk and just think about it. You get away from a screen, get away from a notebook, get away from things that have the pressure of writing down. Give yourself that freedom. So start first with your method and acknowledging that it isn't something that is necessarily set in stone. It can fluctuate, it can change. And you should adapt to it as you need to. Now, this is something I hear from a lot of writers, no matter their method, no matter their skill level, they will have a specific goal in mind when they start a plot, when they start a story. And that's perfectly okay. You should never feel like, oh, this is a bad idea because I just thought of one idea and I just whimsically want to do this thing. Yeah, you're doing something whimsically. It's a story. It's for fun. You're doing entertainment. It's fun. So, it's fine. There's a 6-book Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner, and this is the one I mentioned in the beginning. Yes. The whole reason, in an interview she said, the whole reason that she started this series was because she imagined one scene in her mind from the first book towards the end of it, and she wanted to write that scene. That's it. 6-book series spawned because she wanted to write one scene. And that was perfectly fine. It's a best-selling novel. It's great. So go with that. It's okay to have your entire story built around this one moment. That's going to be your Act 3 climax, probably, if you're using that structure. It depends on what the scene is, potentially. Yeah, it might fit better on the monomyth. You might hate both of those. It's up to you. But when you have that scene in your mind, you need to know what it is you want out of that scene. In the case of Megan Whalen Turner, there was a scene she had in mind where someone did something kind for other people in the cast, and they were surprised to find both his skill level and his kindness towards them. Obviously, this was going to have to be built up over the course of a story, because you'd have to establish that they don't think of him as someone who is kind and charitable, but enough that they've stuck with him the whole story. Why they need him, maybe? Who knows? Or maybe they are kind of getting along, but it's a very tenuous alliance and they didn't expect him to risk himself for them. That kind of thing, that he shows more skill than they expected because he's not who they thought he was. That is all going to need to be built up to. I'm keeping it vague because I don't know what your idea is. You're going to want to follow that for yourself. Figure out what it is you want from that scene and then build up to that. You can't just go right to it. Now, when you're writing, you can absolutely start on the scene you want to write the most. It's probably for the best that you do, because you'll be able to look at that scene and say, okay, now what do I need for this to hit the right emotional impact? Go that way. What do they need to know? They need to know the dynamic between them. They need to see that tenuous relationship. They need to see all kinds of things to make that scene hit right. That's how it's going to work. That's what you need, and you might not know that until you write it. So give yourself that freedom to do what you need to do to get that through. Now, plot pointers. You are going to want to be adaptable. I know I've said it a ton of times, but I really need to drive it home here, especially with plot. Things will not always go how you planned or envisioned. This is why plot holes are a thing. This is why Deus Machina is a thing. Like, plenty of writers with tons of experience will stare at their story and be like, what have I done? You might have to adapt to something because you didn't see it coming. And that's fine. This is a particularly bigger issue, obviously, in serial plot, like, pieces, because you can't just go back and rewrite something and be like, no one saw that. No, because you already posted chapter 4. People did see that. So it's like you are a little more locked in with things like that. But it can happen to anyone, so give yourself that leeway, give yourself that freedom. Be adaptable. Don't feel like because you plotted it out, you have to go that way. Go with what makes the story better. And on a similar note, kill your darlings is a common phrase used for when the writer is clearly attached to something and doesn't want to let it go, even at the expense of the story. Like, if you feel like a story isn't moving, if it's stalling, if you're having a harder time writing it, or people don't seem as interested in it, find the things that you aren't budging on. Now, people losing interest could also be, there's a variety of reasons for that. So I would say it's more like if it's hard for you, if you feel like the story isn't clicking, it isn't resonating like it used to, you really need to look at the things that you aren't budging on and decide why they're there. Is it for the story, or is it because you really like Kevin? Like, Kevin's a great character and you love him, true. But if Kevin must die for the story to grow, then Kevin must die. And it's sad, and you're going to be disappointed, but it's a price you're willing to pay. As the writer, it's kind of your thing. So don't be afraid of that. And it is something that's very easy to have happen without realizing it. You could just be like, but I really love them. And then you've discovered your problem. That's why I say, look at the things that you won't budge on and see what's holding you up. Inversely, you can look at what's holding up the story and see if any of those are things you won't budge on. It might be easier that way. Whichever one's simpler for you. Number 3, when you are brainstorming, take your editing, critiquing hat, your self-dub voices, and throw them aside. You are not critiquing these ideas. When you are brainstorming, you are just compiling a list of things that you might maybe want to do or try or could work. Even if you think they're dumb, you can be like, this is the dumbest idea I've ever written. I'm going to write it. Just put it down. When you are making ideas, it is a completely different realm than critiquing these ideas. So my biggest suggestion to you is to write it all down. I can't tell you how many times that I have, when other writers have not written an idea down, thought maybe we might have liked it, but because we didn't write it down, we don't remember it, and now we have to start completely over. We have this list, and all we can think about is that one idea we can't remember. So write it down. Whatever it is, write it down. Don't eliminate it, because you'll appreciate having it there. There have been plenty of times too where I've crossed out an idea, circled it because I think I might like it, crossed it out again, and then started because I definitely liked it. You will waffle like that, and it's fine. It's fine. The other thing you're going to want to do is give it time. Sometimes your first instinct is on point. It's your intuitive reaction, it's what readers are going to think, and it helps you lead the story in a direction that makes sense. Other times, it's literally the tropiest, most uninteresting thing you could have done, and that's fine. Again, you are a content consumer, first and foremost. You've been reading and watching movies and playing games longer than you've been making stuff. That's for sure. No matter what, no matter how experienced you are or how old you are, you have been reading stories and consuming them way longer than you've been making them. So you're sometimes going to have the first idea be your junkyard dog, and you just need a little bit of time to sit there and think, yes, we're going to rent a porta potty instead. It's your nth idea after brainstorming forever that you come up with it. So don't be afraid to give the process time. Sometimes you just gotta do that. Now, the last step here is balancing fan service. Where it really comes in play here is that you do need to treat your readers, spoil them a little. You are here to ham it up a bit. This is your audience, and you want them to enjoy themselves. But you are going to have to put the story first, and whatever you can't use, you can always set aside as bonus content. Now, without further ado, we dig into this. Treat your readers. If you see your readers latching onto an idea or a character that you weren't planning on exploring, but you've got room to do it, go for it. They're enjoying it, they're having fun. Look at what they're enjoying, why they're enjoying it. Cater to them a little. If you can do it and there's space in your story for it, do it. Now, it might not always be a chapter in the story. This might also be bonus content too, but it's totally worth it. One of the stories, fanfictions that I'm writing, is for Dragon Age 2, and a reader of mine who has been consistently following this story said that they were really curious what Carver was thinking, and I was like, that's actually really brilliant. It sounds like it'd be a really fun idea to look at, and I'm not sure if I'm going to make it a chapter yet, or if I'm going to make it a self-standing story and make it a series on Archive of Our Own, and kind of pair them together that way. Because all the POV chapters at this point have all been in Hawk's perspective, third person close, I don't do first person, but those have all been from Hawk's perspective at this point, and it might slow the plot down to mention Carver's feelings, but it is a really fun thought. I might just put it on the side as something that's kind of interesting. If you find an opportunity to do it, go for it. There is no such thing as content you can't use. You know, there's so many special edition books out there. I have the Queen's Thief series with all short stories in them that are just special because they're part of the books well after they were published the first time. So I got special edition ones that had short stories in them. Nothing you can't use is really there. So you can write it out and then ended up including it in a different version of the story that's special or an anniversary edition or something. Whether you're a fanfiction writer who just posts on Twitter and be like, this would be the second year I've been on Archive of Our Own and this is what I want to share, or you are planning to sell your stories and you are a Patreon writer like me, and this is how you structure it. You can find a use for these things, whether you're hobbyist or professional. It has a place. And now that's just the best part for me of serial stories is if you're going by book or by chapter, whatever kind of serial installment you structure, you can respond to your reader interest as you go. And they're telling you what they're wanting to hear, what they want to see, what they want more of. Answer when you can. Now, I do need to emphasize this above all else. A reader predicting how the story will go is not a bad thing. Some people will put up a fuss about it, be like, oh, I figured this out in chapter 3. Well, go away. Kevin, don't tell anybody. Worse Kevin. The Kevin that we don't like, I guess. Lesser Kevin. It's fine if your readers pick up on the hints you've been giving them. That's okay. And it doesn't have to be a mind-blowing turn of events either. It just has to be a good, enjoyable story. Now, people being surprised is fine too, is the other thing. There's no wrong way to enjoy your story. Like, there's no wrong way to enjoy dessert. It's dessert. As long as you are enjoying it, you did it. Go you. Like, that's what you have to remember from this, is that all of your readers are enjoying your story the way they choose to enjoy it. That's fine. Now, as the writer, it is your responsibility to put the story first. Yes, even before the readers. Because you know the story. You know where it's going. Not them. They don't have the full picture. They're speculating because it's fun, they're talking to each other, they're just enjoying themselves. You can't give them everything they want. With that fanfiction I was telling you about earlier, there have been plenty other predictions that I can't do or are simply not true, and I'm not going to redo the whole plot to make them true because I didn't build up to them. There's nothing. It would feel too much like I was writing the story based on what they were telling me, which would kind of be offensive at that point. I keep the story the way it is, but I'm willing to put more content out there based on what they want to hear. You've got to put the story first. I would never sacrifice the pacing or the plotting of a story to appeal to someone and their theory. They wouldn't actually enjoy it because it wouldn't be the story I planned. So it's fine. You can't always do what everyone wants, and you can't always please everyone. I have also said that before, but I'm going to say that again too. Someone out there is going to like the shopkeep that shows up once in chapter 20 and have all kinds of headcanons about them and just really latch on to them, and you can't rewrite the whole story to please that person. That's fine. You can't make the shopkeep in chapter 20 the focus of this story. You can keep them in mind. You can see if there's anything you can do for them later. But this story right here, right now, not gonna happen. You didn't plan that, and that's okay. You don't have to. Put your story first. Now, here we are with keeping ideas for later, your bonus content. Some ideas are worth exploring, either for hype to build up interest, or as a reward on Patreon. I have monthly polls on my Patreon with all patrons from $1 and up being able to vote on the patron-only content I do every month, and one of my more popular original characters, Nate Saito, does get attention fairly often. Either when I do free content, he gets likes on his content, or he gets voted for in the polls because he's just a genuinely likable character, even though he has no story going on for him as of yet. There's no, like, official story. He's not in Saving Ourselves. He's not in Where Ages Meet. He's just a character of mine that people seem to like, so I use him to make more content for rewards on Patreon, either in free-to-read stuff or in things they vote for. Listen to your readers and see the kinds of things they like. In the case of a poll, you can put them as an option on the list and see what comes of it. Whatever you can't devote your attention to, you can potentially use as bonus content. But I want to mention very specifically that when you write one-off stories about a day in that character's life, like that shopkeep from chapter 20, you need to make sure there's enough interest to warrant you doing that. Assuming you are like most writers and you have very sensitive muse, you'll be very disappointed if you write something special and you don't get a good reaction from it, or you don't get enough of a reaction from it. If you have 500 people following a story and one of them likes the shopkeep, there is simply not enough people who like this shopkeep for you to write about it. And that's okay. You can write about someone else. Because you are going to need that volume of a response to, one, make sure you feel gratified in writing instead of disappointed and wondering why you even bother, because we all know what that ends up as. You know, lying face down on a couch eating Cheetos at 2 a.m. because you didn't get the reaction you wanted. You don't want to do that to yourself. You don't want to fall into that creative pit of despair. So make sure that when you're writing something, that you're going to write something that will be rewarding both for your interest in sharing a story with people who want to hear it, but also for the people who want to read it. You want to make sure that you reach people who are invested in the story and are happy to have it. Because that's what storytelling really is about, is engaging with your audience that way. So more interest may generate for this shopkeep from chapter 20 someday, but until then, you need to make sure that you're writing bonus content that rewards you for the effort that you put in, because you did put in effort. It takes skill, it takes time, it takes passion. You did all of that. You deserve the reward for it. Anyway, if you have any final questions, absolutely let me know. I'm always happy to talk. Honestly, you can find me anywhere on any of those sites down there. Just DM me. This panel will be available on YouTube. I will make it public after the Ren Fair has ended. And any of my things that you go through, any of my stories, any of my panels, anything I have shared, no matter how old it is or anything like that, I love hearing from you guys. Engagement is my lifeblood. I love the sense of community that comes from storytelling. That is my favorite part of being a writer, is that sense of community. So you will never disappoint me if you send me something to ask about something, to show you liked it, if you just keyboard smash, if you send me 9 paragraphs. It's totally cool with me. I love all of it. So comment, love, share, ask me things. I am happy to talk, and I'm very grateful you came today to this panel. And I'm going to also remind you to take care of yourself, go for a stretch, get a snack, have some water, be good to yourself, and farewell.